Well, good morning or good evening, wherever you are in the world at the moment, to Pulsing Freeze and Maximum Production. I'm Selwyn Donald, your new host, and today we're going to be talking to Stacey Hendriks about wearables. Now, that's not, folks, the latest in fashion designing shoes or the makeup or whatever out there for you ladies, or even the guys that like to get dressed up pretty dapperly. Wearables, what we're talking about today is wearables for cows, especially dairy cows. So welcome, Stacey. I'll just give you a brief summary, folks out there, that who this lady is we're going to be talking to. Stacey Hendriks. Stacey has been a scientist with Dairy New Zealand since 2023, having previously worked both at Tishkakis, I think I've said that right or wrong, but anyway, in Ireland, and Massey University as a postdoctoral research. Stacey's nomadic childhood as the daughter of steer-milking parents who relished challenging the status quo sowed the seed for her interest in science and its application in the dairy sector. Stacey has a research background in animal science, particularly in the areas of dairy cattle health, behaviour and welfare. She has a Bachelor of Science and a Master and PhD qualifications in Animal Science, all from Massey University. Her role at Dairy NZ is focused on ensuring dairy animals have a good life through research that provides farmers with knowledge to support good health, appropriate behaviour and good environmental conditions for their cows. Her PhD investigated the use of wearable technology to signal the behavioural changes that could indicate the presence of transition disease in dairy cows, and her postdoctoral research focused on hypoketomia in grazing dairy cows. Stacey has a strong background in wrangling and analysing large data sets, which is becoming sought after skill in research programs are increasingly data rich due to the use of sensor technology. So welcome, Stacey. That's a pretty damn impressive resume there, young lady. And welcome to the Holstein Friesian Maximum Production podcast.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me. Yeah, looking forward to contributing to the conversation on wearables today.
It's a changing world environmentally, with the changing world at the moment when you look at what's happening in the Middle East, etc. And every day is a different day. But look, wearables, what are they? And if possible, what percentage of New Zealand dairy farmers are actually using them?
Yeah, so I guess when we talk about wearables and dairy farming, we're referring to on-animal sensor technologies. So these are devices that are attached to cows. And so there's a range of devices on the market. We've got AirTag type sensors, rumen boluses, collars, and they usually continuously capture some type of behavior data, maybe physiology data. So for example, rumen temperature from the boluses. And some systems have virtual fencing technologies. So basically, these devices also monitor a range of those different behaviours that I sort of mentioned. So we've got things like grazing behaviour, rumination time, lying behaviour, activity. Then you've got things like rumen or air temperature, depending on the device. And most of these devices will give you heat detection and cycling event information as well. You've got a range of technologies that are now also like integrating other capabilities. So they're adding in things like pasture management tools. And then in terms of like the adoption side of things, so at Dairy NZ, we track technology updates through the Technology in Workplace survey. And that looks at a range of technologies used on farms. So things like automated drafting gates, cup removers, automated teat sprayers, things like that. So for wearables specifically, adoption has grown rapidly. So the survey tracked wearable farmers in 2018 was sitting at about 3% of farms using wearables at the time. And by 2023, that had increased to around 18% of farms. So based on industry conversations, we think that the current adoption rate could probably sit above about 30%. So it's already gone up quite substantially in the last 2.5 years. But we don't have firm national data on that, and we're not actually sure where market saturation would sit.
Yeah, it's quite interesting, Stacey, you drive around the country, and especially with my role for Holstein Friesian New Zealand, there's not many roads you travel down without seeing cows grazing with collars on. And that's not, there's possibly ones that haven't have got the ear tags or the boluses. It is becoming a really important, tool used by a host of New Zealand farmers, irrespective of their location, their climate, their altitude, their environment, etc. So yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
What are the main reasons then as to why farmers are adopting the use of wearables?
Yeah, so the reason farmers adopt wearables seems to vary depending on the technology. So obviously different technologies have different capabilities. As I mentioned earlier, some of them have virtual fencing capabilities, and some of them maybe are more targeted towards just like heat detection, things like that. So I would be able to probably categorize some of the common drivers based on what's on the market. So like a key reason would be labour efficiency, trying to improve work-life balance for both owner-operators and farm staff. And probably the clearest example of this is through the automated heat detection. So it's just removing the need to have a person in the shed on the vet stand for 10 to 12 weeks or 8 to 10 weeks probably during mating to identify cows in heat. The other probably major driver is with the virtual fencing systems that can obviously reduce labour involved in grazing management. So putting up temporary fences, doing pasture walks and plate metering, physically herding cows to and from the cow shed or between breaks. Farmers have a range of reasons to adopt, obviously. Those are some key examples, but we have heard farmers talk about just enjoying interacting with the technology itself as a motivator. They find it a useful way to engage their farm staff in key management decisions, especially if they've got maybe more technical savvy staff. And it can also help them support monitoring of issues that were maybe more challenging to identify before, like things like heat stress. If you've got the likes of a bolus, and you could look at things like room and temperature as an indicator of potential heat stress. So yeah, there's definitely a range of motivators, but I would say most of them link back to on-farm efficiency and that labour piece.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, the points you make, actually. And I was travelling around doing some COP inspecting, so approving heifers, and one guy, it's only a small farm, mind you, and he was just installing collars. And I said, what's the reason why that? And he said, well, he was going to, one would be easier grazing, and he could actually spend an extra hour in bed in the morning because the cows could be brought to the feed pad, which he had set up the night before. And said it was making him more efficient because he had more hours in the day because he wasn't so worn out, to be fair. And the other thing as well is I think that it's like you put the probe in the ground, don't you, for the soil temperature, for the grass growth levels and the watering, etc. This is actually basically putting up some data there that says this needs to be done now or needs to be looked at now, rather than the old eye and go, oh yeah, well, I'll wait till next week or I'll wait till the neighbours do it or whatever. So yeah, no, interesting points there. So what are the main KPI benefits for farmers who have wearable devices? How are they measuring this?
Yeah, so I guess you touched on, Selwyn, about, probably what would be an intrinsic benefit, maybe getting a few more lions in the morning if you can kind of optimize your farm system by having virtual fencing or whatever it might be. So I think there's really clear benefits that farmers see in terms of those more intrinsic benefits, things that are more difficult to put a cost on, or that maybe aren't specifically drivers of farm profitability and things like that. But ultimately, when we're thinking about measurable farm KPIs, the evidence is less clear in terms of what the benefits of wearables are. So these are important, obviously, because they do drive improvements in farm performance and ultimately profitability. And so that can be a key factor for certain farmers to determine if it's a worthwhile investment. So based on the reasons farmers typically adopt, which I mentioned before, so managing mating and labour efficiency, I think the key KPIs we might expect to influence would be the reproductive metrics, 3-week submission rate, and then 6-week in-calf rate, probably your key ones there. And then time spent on farm or on specific farm tasks as they relate to labour efficiency would probably be your other sort of key KPIs that you might consider. So I guess if I unpack a little bit of the research that's been done in those two areas. For the labour efficiency piece, we haven't had a lot of studies done in pasture-based systems that directly try and quantify the labour efficiency between farms with and without wearables. It's pretty clear though that if you can automate certain tasks, that you'll reduce the time spent on those tasks. But I think to the point that you actually mentioned before is that a lot of owner operators say that they don't necessarily spend less time on farm overall, but they might use the time that they gain differently, so they can focus on more strategic planning, reviewing farm performance, or spending more time on animal care or other areas that maybe they feel they don't have enough time. So that's obviously a potential benefit. In terms of the reproductive performance, so there was a study led by Dr. Paul Edwards at Dairy NZ, published in the New Zealand Journal of Agricultural Research journal this year. And they looked specifically at the impact of wearables on reproductive performance. So what they did is they looked at farms that had used wearables for at least 2 years, and then they matched them with similar control farms based on similarities across the farms, like location, herd size, production level, and planned start of calving, to sort of try and compare apples with apples effectively. And then they compared the reproductive performance using the AI records that were available and calving data to confirm if that AI record had likely resulted in conception of a viable calf. And basically, the interesting finding there was that the farms adopting wearables were already quite high-performing herds before adopting the technology. So before adoption, they were averaging around 86% 6-week and an 82% 3-week submission rate. So putting that into context, the New Zealand dairy statistics for 24-25 season, the national averages were 70% for 6-week and calf rate. So those before adoption farms were about 16% higher than the average. And then the 3-week submission rate was 80.5% for the average. So about a 1.5 increase in those other wearable farms compared to the national averages. So then because of that, basically the research team decided, to focus on within farm changes. So actually looking within farm, comparing the 3 weeks before they adopted with the 2 years after they adopted, to look at the repro performance across time. What they did find, which was quite interesting, I think, was it did seem to influence reproductive management, the adoption of wearables, even though they didn't change significantly the core KPIs. So after adopting wearables, some farmers did increase the length of their AI mating period. So, not getting that sort of heat detection fatigue that you might experience once you sort of get to week 8 to 10 of mating, and being able to actually do AI all the way out to 12 weeks, because you've got the technology doing the mating detection for you, not needing someone to stand on the platform picking up those last stragglers towards the end of mating. So that allowed them to basically move away from bull matings completely. It didn't have any effect overall though on their 6-week and calf rate or their 3-week submission rate before or after adoption. So basically that does indicate there isn't strong evidence that wearables automatically improve reproductive KPI. Potentially decide when to use interventions like CEDARs or synchrony programs due to that more accurate pre-mating cycling data, and they get more information on return rates and things like that during the entire mating period, because they obviously are getting heat detection all the way out to sort of 12 plus weeks from this planned start of mating. So yeah, there's kind of a range of potential ways to optimize mating performance, but it's not necessarily then leading to improved in-calf rates and things like that. But they might be able to, get higher value calves out of their animals if they can use sex semen, things like that.
Yeah, and some farmers I've spoken to have got these devices have said that the amount of cows with the submission rate in their particular herds have lifted, because they've picked up cows that are actually cycling and are in heat but actually are not standing, or there's no visible signs. So it's those undetected heats that I guess is a big plus in what you're saying. Is there a device out there at the moment? I guess there's one currently being made along the lines of, or added to the data of, when a cow actually does get in calf.
Yeah, to my knowledge, I don't know of any at the moment that can pinpoint pregnancy diagnosis. There are like some milk-based tests being developed, to my knowledge, that could help with earlier pregnancy detection. But yeah, it's definitely not something that I have a lot of expertise in per se, but it would be great if one day we could get to a point of having like earlier pregnancy diagnosis and not necessarily needing to rely on doing it at the end of the mating period.
Yeah, well, there's a challenge where you could do it and make a fortune. How's that? But I'm sure there is, the companies out there are probably looking into this as we speak, no doubt. Just moving on, so is the data collected in each individual farm being shared, with vets, farm consultants, nutritionists, accountants, bankers, to help make more profitable decisions?
Yeah, so I think at this stage, we haven't specifically determined like who farmers are sharing their data with. We know that vets and farm consultants have become very active in this space. Many of them are like helping farmers to interpret the wearable data. So the key bits of information that we are aware that vets and farm consultants seem to be working with is rumination time. They also look at often, like particularly vets that are helping with reproductive intervention decisions, things like that, are looking at pre-mating cycling information, return rates during mating as well. So there is like a bunch of information there that essentially farmers can use alongside like their decision making, and when they're meeting with consultants or vets that are helping them to make management changes on farm, they can sort of use that information to make more informed decisions. But for some farmers, it's also just helping them to actually make sense of the data, because they're getting all this information fed to them, but they don't necessarily know how to implement it or what to do with it. So yeah, we actually ran some focus groups last year, where we talked to a group of 5 farmers and then a group of vets and RPs that had been working with wearable data for multiple seasons. And the purpose of those focus groups was to really understand how the data was being used day to day to inform on-farm decision making. One of the strongest messages we got from those discussions from the vets and RPs was that they really felt like it was helping them build stronger relationships with farmers by having this more like objective information about what had happened on the farm across the season. So, you come in pre-mating. Typically, if you didn't have this information on hand, you'd maybe ask a farmer like, oh, how's the season been? And you might get, oh yeah, good. And you sort of don't know what to then do with that information because you can't kind of dig into it a little bit deeper. And so actually having detailed information about rumination changes across the transition period and looking at that pre-mating cycling information gave vets and advisors more objective data that they could sit down and they could sort of say, look, it looks like this is going really well, or there's some potential flow-on effects of what's happened during the transition period. Maybe you had a lot of health alerts, things like that, and now that's showing up in your perhaps like lower pre-mating cycling rates than you might expect. And so then it kind of allowed them to then focus on solutions and also do some forward planning. So like, what maybe didn't go so well this season, what can we implement next season to improve on that? So it's really helping them to be more proactive in those conversations. And one thing that I think was really nice that a vet did say within the group, they said that the information from the collar is basically backing up and supporting the things that have already been said for like a very, very long time. But having that kind of data hitting you in the face, I guess, was helping them to create change and really getting farmers on board. So ultimately, I guess what's really important to remember with wearables in particular and getting the most out of the data is it doesn't replace good stockmanship or good farm management, but it can help to like reinforce and provide feedback about, whether you're implementing those foundational farming principles well. And the data does typically reflect management decisions, and so it can act as like a helpful feedback loop for farmers that their advisors can also like talk to. In terms of, I guess you did touch on like, bankers and accountants and I guess people that are sort of less involved in maybe like the day-to-day and more strategic decisions. I don't really know a lot in that space in terms of how much it's being used. So yeah, definitely a space to maybe like explore a little bit more if there's opportunity there.
Yeah, I guess with them, the bankers, the accountants, etc., one either may be extending loans to put in these wearables, and I guess then and the accountants, etc., will then saying, well, okay, where's our return? Or where's your return? Sorry, on investment of them. So
Yeah.
I think there's a common theme coming through from everything here, Stacey, is that the wearables seem to be, I guess, the advantage of them at the moment. Just listening to you then is really just as it's the problems that sort of arise on the horizon. It's been met earlier than when the problem actually is hard cold face. So I guess especially with the mating, if they're not actually on a forward plateau and rumination is down, it's all been detected rather than in a wet, cold spring and early mating, and everyone's got their heads down, bums up working. It's actually there in front of you, isn't it? And you're not seeing it because, it does get pretty stressful at those times. But then if you've got the data there that's going, well, have a look at this. So, like, moving on, wearables help you make more profitable decisions like labour, reproductive, animal health, pasture management, environmental protection.
Yeah, so I'd say like this is still quite an open question, and I think it's an important one because it probably feeds into those comments you made about, involving accountants and, your bank manager and stuff like that into investment decisions. But because we've already touched on labour efficiency and repro, I kind of mentioned that there's no real evidence that there's like real tangible economic benefits there. Unless, of course, you captured that labour efficiency as like reduced cost in terms of like staff time, things like that. Probably other areas where wearables could influence performance would be things like around animal health and pasture management. But there's very little research in that space at the moment in pasture-based systems that like directly measure these impacts and then how that might flow on to like economic outcomes. So there's a little bit of work that's been done overseas in housed cows. This has looked specifically at whether health alerts from wearables do improve like the economics of disease detection and treatment. So interestingly, some of those studies have found that lower performing farms sometimes see a small cost benefit due to effectively picking up health issues early and then being able to treat disease and be more efficient in that regard. And then that obviously has potential downstream impacts on things like milk production, as well as like reproductive outcomes or likelihood of culling from the herd. Higher performing farms often, however, saw little benefit or slightly negative returns. So effectively, if your farm's already doing a really great job at identifying health issues, potentially adopting the wearable, you could actually pick up fewer health issues or potentially just not see as much of an improvement because you're already doing a really good job. So then I guess overall, like across all those areas, there's no current evidence that adopting wearables would consistently improve profitability because you really would need to link the adoption of wearables to those clear like farm KPIs that drive profit. So we'd want to see things like improved reproductive performance, higher milk production or better pasture utilisation, reduced labour costs and reduced animal health costs. What I have like thought about a little bit over the last couple of years, like getting more involved in this space, and it's an idea that I really like that was captured actually by a scientist from the Netherlands called Dr. Mariska van der Voort. She gave a keynote at the Precision Dairy Farming Conference in Christchurch last year, and she sort of suggested flipping the question on its head. And what we usually ask about technology is like, what is the return on investment of this technology? And she sort of suggested that the more useful question might actually be like, what does this technology need to achieve on farm for it to be economically viable to adopt? So I think that framing is helpful because it encourages farmers to be like very clear about what problem they want the technology to solve. So as an example, if the goal is to save time, automate heat detection, automate identification of health issues, having greater confidence and transparency when they're off farm, or is it actually less about an economic benefit and more about an intrinsic benefit, getting a few more sleep-ins or having better work-life balance? And those are all perfectly, acceptable reasons to adopt, but it really is like an individual farmer decision. So once I think that goal is clear about what you're trying to achieve, then you can really figure out which is the best technology to kind of meet that goal. And then understand, what are the limitations of the different technologies, and decide how you actually determine if it's been successful once you've adopted. So that kind of just helps you avoid, I guess, adopting technology just because it's new or trendy, and make sure you're clearly trying to solve a real farm problem that is unique to your farm system.
Yeah, there's some really good points in there, and I guess from the Netherlands lady that spoke at that Precision Dairy Farming Conference, there's some real, like, that is, I think, is a really great way to sum it up, the KPIs and whether you should or shouldn't do it. So now, given the research is limited, as we've heard from you, in this space, and the impact of wearables on farm KPIs is unclear, what is Dairy New Zealand doing in this space to help fill those knowledge gaps?
Yeah, so at Dairy NZ, we do have an active program of work looking at wearables and their impact on the farm system and business KPIs. So we're sort of taking a two-pronged approach at the moment. From an extension perspective, based on information that's already out there, we're just trying to support farmers who have already adopted the technology, or those that are maybe considering it, and just to provide them some independent and unbiased advice. And we're using a range of channels to do that. So if people are interested to look for more information on wearables, they can look at our website. We've got some events running throughout the country. Most of those have already occurred, but essentially we'll continue to provide opportunities for farmers to learn through our platforms, and potentially other channels like this, podcasts, things like that. And then from a research perspective, we are working directly with farmers, and the key objective there is to really help us to identify the key knowledge gaps that farmers want answers to certain research questions. So we had a workshop last November, and farmers told us that they wanted a better understanding of a range of areas. Just to sort of summarise that at a high level, there were questions around which data streams they should focus on at key times of the year. Obviously, you're getting all of this information, but are there sort of certain key pieces of data that are more, I guess, impactful or informative at certain times of the year? They wanted to sort of understand what certain data streams actually mean. You've got a lot of conversations happening around rumination time and how to actually interpret that data, wanting to understand what typical values farmers could expect and how that might vary for individual cows and at different herd levels, and how that maybe has a regional impact or other factors that impact those values that they're seeing in the data. They were also quite interested to have a bit more understanding of how wearable data links to farm KPIs. As I mentioned, there's not actually a lot of research being done in that space. And then finally, I guess at a more sector level, could that wearable data eventually contribute to things like genetic selection? Have we got essentially access to new phenotypes that we maybe couldn't select for before? Are there certain behaviours that are associated with a more resilient cow? So I think there's enormous potential here. Across the national herd, based on our current estimated levels of adoption, we're generating more than 20 million data points every day across our cows that have wearables. And so that's a massive resource of data that we've never had availability to before. And so I think there's a huge opportunity for the dairy sector, but it does create challenges. We hear all the time that farmers do experience data overwhelm or analysis paralysis. So I think a key focus for Dairy NZ is really just helping farmers moving from just collecting data to actually using it strategically in their farm businesses so that they can really get value from the investment that they've made.
That's some really good points. So I guess, and you, where do you see it in 10 years' time?
That's a really good question. I would definitely like to see it being used more strategically at a sector level. I think there's a lot of opportunity to integrate this data with other data streams, but obviously we've got some challenges with the data ownership and different companies collecting different data streams and maybe not being able to easily integrate those. If you could connect like milk processor data with wearable data, with minder data, like how much potential additional value you could leverage out of that. I think there's also potentially a space in the future for maybe the use of AI or generative AI tools, and potentially also helping with trying to analyze or make sense of the data. So I think, ultimately in 10 years' time, I'd hope to see that we're actually leveraging the data that we're collecting to its full potential, rather than, capturing all this information that maybe is only really used in real time, rather than using it more strategically to make longer term decisions.
Yeah, I guess in saying that data collected could also help with bargaining power with actual facts now on say like methane emissions, etc. Moving down the track.
I think we're only scratching the surface, really. Like, we're trying to help farmers kind of use it on farm for their day-to-day management, and I think there's probably a lot more opportunity to see how it like correlates with other parts of the farm business, like you say, greenhouse gas emissions, maybe even looking for potential like novel indicators of certain levels of feed conversion efficiency in individual animals, things like that. We've not really explored that in depth at this stage.
No. Well, that's been really interesting. You're obviously passionate about your job and you love the data collection side of things and analysing it. So thank you on behalf of New Zealand Holstein Friesian from our podcast here. I'm sure that a lot of our members out there and those associated to them and people listening are going to get some valuable information, some insight onto what you've presented for us today. So wholeheartedly thank you very much. Thoroughly enjoyed it. It's been really good. This is my first podcast actually, but thoroughly enjoyed the knowledge and just the way you've presented things. And I think I said in an email a day or so ago, reading your resume, very clever lady, and we wish you well in the future for your endeavours and collecting this data and feeding it down the line to the dairy farmers.
Yeah, thanks so much, Selwyn. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, awesome, Stacey. All the best for the future. Thank you.